Romanticism of London by William Blake. So a little bit of context first of all. William Blake was born in 1757 and died in 1827, and he was one of the early Romantic poets. You'll be studying a few Romantic poets for your GCSE anthology poetry, so it's important to know some of the key concepts in Romanticism. One of the first things to know is that they place huge importance on emotion and imagination, which took priority for them over reason and logic. They also all had this almost religious response to nature. They saw nature as something that was divine, or something that was a perfect example of God's creation. They had a reverence for the innocence of childhood, and also an interest in and concern for the outcasts of society. Blake held fairly radical views for his era. He believed in social equality, including equality between men and women, and while he was a very highly religious person, he saw the church as an institute which was one that was hypocritical and corrupt. So the poem itself, London, comes from Blake's collection, Songs of Innocence and Experience. The first half of that collection, Songs of Innocence, was published in 1789, and it contains much more positive poems dealing with themes such as the beauty of the natural world and the innocence of childhood. Whereas the second half, Songs of Experience, he wrote a few years later. It was published in 1793, and it contains far more negative poems about the corruption of innocence. So as you can probably tell, London comes from the second half of that collection, Songs of Experience. So on to the poem itself. In London, the speaker describes the inescapable misery and poverty of London, and he seems to feel that the powerful institutions of the country, such as the church and the monarchy, are causing these problems. We get a pretty clear sense that the speaker is probably Blake himself, although some people have argued that because the speaker seems fairly detached and is able to be kind of everywhere at once and looks at the whole of London in one go, some have argued that it could be a kind of ghostly figure. In terms of the form and structure of the poem, it's written in iambic tetrameter, so I'll get on to exactly what that means in a moment. It has an alternating rhyme scheme, meaning it goes A, B, A, B all the way through. And that very regulated, consistent rhythm, rhyme scheme and structure reflects the ideas of entrapment and constraint that we will see in the poem. So I mentioned already this idea of the rhythm of the poem being iambic tetrameter. What that means, we can split it up into its two parts to make a little bit more sense. The iambic part of that tells us the type of rhythm in the poem. So an iambic rhythm goes da-dum, and that's what we would call 1 foot, 1 metric foot, or 1 beat. And the tetrameter part tells that there are 4 of those metric feet, or 4 beats per line. So if we have a look, for example, at the first line of the poem, it goes, I wander through each charted street, da-dum, 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 da-dum. So that's what iambic tetrameter means. If you read the poem and you can tell that it's got this fairly steady da-dum, 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 da-dum rhythm, that means that it's an iambic rhythm. And here it's 4 beats, so it's tetrameter. But it's not enough just to be able to identify the rhythm and the metre of a poem. You also need to be able to explain why that's been used or talk about it in some way. So the key ways that we would want to kind of discuss it here would be firstly thinking about why such a strict and steady rhythm has been used. Here in this poem, it seems to help reflect this idea of constraint. This is a poem which deals with people who are restricted by the institutions in London as well as by themselves. And the fact that the poem has a very, very strict and steady rhythm helps to reflect that idea. What we could also think about is whether the iambic rhythm places emphasis on any particular words. And we could also consider whether the rhythm is broken anywhere and if that could be significant. So we'll be looking out for a couple of those ideas as we look through the poem. So getting on to analysing the poem itself now, let's have a look at the first stanza. I wander through each charted street, near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. So that verb in the very first line, I wander through, it immediately suggests a sense of aimlessness or purposelessness. It reflects this idea that the speaker feels powerless to change anything. And he's wandering through charted streets. The word charted means something that's mapped out. And this introduces that idea of constraint and restriction. The fact that that word is repeated also suggests that the whole city is affected. Wherever you go, you are constrained and locked in and trapped. It's also significant that it's not just the streets that are mapped out, but even the Thames River. Even the natural elements of the city are under human control. And that was one of the things that Blake found really worrying. It was when humans tried to place control over the natural elements of the world. As we've already discussed, nature was something that was seen as very, very important by the Romantic poets. Now on to line 3, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. That word mark in line 3 has a double meaning. It literally means that he notices in every face he meets. But it could also suggest that he is marked or affected by what he sees. And the marks that he sees in the faces of these people, again, the literal meaning is that he's looking at their facial expressions and he's seeing weakness and woe. So he's literally seeing the emotion on their faces. But the word marks also has connotations of scarring, suggesting that these people are very deeply affected by having to live in this city, and the repetition helps to emphasise that as well. There's a term that I've used here, trochaic substitution, and that's one of the things that I was just referring to earlier when I was talking about the use of iambic tetrameter. So in this poem we've got a fairly strong iambic rhythm all the way through, where the second syllable is stressed. I wander through each charted street near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet. But in this fourth line, the rhythm is very clearly on that first syllable, marks of weakness, marks of woe. So the rhythm has been reversed, and that's called a trochaic substitution. This places emphasis on the marks, which again emphasises just how deeply affected these people are. And the final thing to mention about this stanza is the alliteration that joins together these two words, weakness and woe, emphasising those words, creating that highly negative tone, which is evident all the way through the poem. So on to stanza 2. We've got more repetition here in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban. The mind-forged manacles I hear. And that repetition is again emphasising this feeling of bleakness, and the despair and misery, which we've seen already in the poem, clearly affects absolutely everyone. There is no escape from it. This ban, which is referenced in line 3, the clearer definition of that, which you'll probably recognise, is the idea that it's a rule against something. But the word ban in Blake's time also meant a curse, and the double meaning is very significant here. In that final line we have one of the really key ideas of the poem, the mind-forged manacles. Manacles mean handcuffs, and if the handcuffs are mind-forged, then it would suggest that the problems that face the people of London, the problems that restrain them, are man-made. So here Blake could be referring to issues like the Industrial Revolution, the corruption of the church, so things that have clearly been created by humankind. Or he could also be referring to the restrictions and the limitations that we actually place on ourselves. And again, we've got a bit more alliteration here, mind-forged manacles, creating that harsh and forceful tone that we've seen quite a bit in the poem already. Okay, stanza 3. This is a stanza which really is vamping up the highly emotive imagery, the chimney sweeper's cry, the blackening church, the hapless soldier, the sigh running in blood down palace walls. So the first of those emotive images is the image of child labour. As we've already talked about, the Romantics were very concerned with the innocence of childhood. So any image of a child facing misery like this would be very significant to point out. The church is described as blackening, which could be a reference to the pollution caused by the Industrial Revolution. It could also simply suggest the corruption of the church, so a couple of interpretations there. And the fact that he's talking about the blackening church and the corruption there could be a wider comment on the institution of the church, which Blake saw as failing to help those in need. At the time, the church spent money on maintaining its own buildings rather than helping the poor, and Blake had a big problem with that. And then the next couple of lines focus on this soldier. The hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. The word hapless means unfortunate, so the unfortunate soldier. And we get a real sense here that this soldier is powerless and controlled by the government. So his discontent, whatever it may be, it might be because he's not in control of his own fate, or because he doesn't necessarily agree with what he's going to war for. But that discontent will become the blood that runs down the palace walls. It could be his own blood, or it could be the blood which is as a result of the acts that he's forced to carry out. So again, we have this sense of other people being in power and in control, and innocent people suffering because of it. And the image of running in blood is a very forceful image of the destruction of conflict. It could be a reference to the French Revolution, which was at first a symbol of freedom for the Romantics, and many of them were really inspired by it. But it descended into violence over the years, and so they stopped being quite so supportive of it. And finally, the reference to palace walls here is another comment on the fact that those in power are the ones who cause the suffering. Innocent people die while those in the palace are protected. Okay, so on to the final stanza, and here is a good place just to point out how the rhythm is being used to create effects. The iambic rhythm places emphasis here, but most through Midnight Streets, I hear, bringing us to this final climactic stanza where Blake is about to reveal what it is that most bothers him about the City of London. And as we get through this stanza, we see that it's not necessarily the institutions and the large, powerful aspects of government, but it's more the individual people who seem to be causing these problems. That takes us back to that idea of the mind-forged manacles created by the individual person. But most through Midnight Streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. This idea of the youthful harlot seems to be a bit of an oxymoron. It's a harsh contrast between the innocence of youth and the immorality of prostitution. And that curse, it's another word in the poem that could have a double meaning. It could literally mean that the prostitute is swearing, or it could be that this harlot, the prostitute, is a curse on the City of London. And that curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues. We've got lots of harsh consonant sounds there in blasts, blights and plagues. And those again add to this very forceful negative tone that we've seen throughout the poem. And here they reflect the distress caused by disease and illness. And there's a sense here that these plagues probably refer to venereal disease, because it's talking about the impact of this harlot on a marriage, or it could also be metaphorical. And again, we've got the reference to childhood here, blasts the newborn infant's tear, one of Blake's key concerns being the loss of innocence in children. And finally, the poem ends on this very strange image of the marriage hearse. A hearse is a vehicle that carries the coffin to a funeral. So here we've got this very uneasy image of marriage and death being linked. And the poem ends on this final note of society's corruption. And like I mentioned before, and that corruption is not just at a political and social level, but it's also at a personal level. It's happening within individual people's lives and marriages. It's something which is affecting the whole of society.